2,000 years ago, in the Bay of Naples, Roman engineers did something that sounds like a mistake. They floated wooden forms out over open water and poured concrete straight into the sea. Not next to the sea, into it. At Baianus Sinus, the great breakwater of Baiae, and at Portus Neronis, Nero's harbor down the coast, they mixed lime with volcanic ash, tipped it into the Mediterranean, and walked away. Those blocks are still there. You can dive to them today. After 2,000 years underwater, they remain solid, coherent masses of stone. And inside them, mineralogists have found crystals that took centuries to grow. Some of that crystal work may not even be finished yet. Now hold that against the modern number. Reinforced concrete in a marine environment is designed for decades, not millennia, and engineers can tell you exactly how it dies. Seawater carries chloride ions. The chlorides migrate inward until they reach the steel bars, and the steel corrodes. Rust takes up more space than steel, so the rebar swells and bursts the concrete open from the inside. The sea doesn't even have to break the material detonates itself. Which makes a sentence written in the 1st century extremely awkward. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, describes harbor concrete made with the volcanic dust of Puteoli. As soon as it touches the waves and is submerged, he writes, it becomes a single stone mass, impregnable to the waves and every day stronger. Every day stronger. Modern chemistry filed that line under poetry for about 1900 years, because seawater is the declared enemy of modern concrete. And there was one more detail sitting in plain sight. Every sample of Roman mortar ever examined carries tiny white chunks, millimeters across, scattered through the matrix like freckles. For centuries, the technical literature read them the way any modern inspector would, as evidence of bad mixing, lime that was never properly blended in, a defect. But that reading never quite fit, because the Romans were obsessive about recipes. Vitruvius dictated exact proportions, approved ash sources, even which coast the ash should come from. A culture that meticulous does not sign its greatest works with a botched batch. So maybe the question had been asked backwards all along. What if the defect was the machine? To see why that question deserves a full investigation, you need 2 numbers and 1 uncomfortable habit. Number 1. Concrete is the most consumed substance on Earth after water. Humanity pours on the order of 14 billion cubic meters of it every year, nearly 2 cubic meters for every person alive. It is the literal foundation of everything we build. Number 2, making its binder, Portland cement, releases around 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. If cement were a country, it would sit somewhere between 3rd and 4th place among the world's emitters, ahead of nearly every nation you can name. And the habit, we accept as normal, that concrete cracks, corrodes and gets rebuilt. That cycle isn't an engineering accident. It is a structural feature of how we construct. Pour, crack, corrode, demolish, pour, again. We even put the clock in ourselves. Concrete is strong in compression but weak in tension, so we embed steel to carry the pull. And that steel is what the seawater eventually finds. Against all that, the Roman recipe is almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Lime, volcanic ash, the pulvis they dug from the burning fields around Pozzuoli, chunks of tuff for bulk. And in the harbors, seawater mixed right in, no steel anywhere. Vitruvius wrote it down around 25 BCE, proportions included. For works exposed to the sea, 2 parts ash to 1 part lime. Here is the twist though, and this is where the stakes climb. We have had that recipe for 500 years. Renaissance scholars recovered Vitruvius in the 15th century, and engineers have mixed lime and pozzolana ever since. It makes good mortar. It does not make 2,000-year harbor blocks. Something essential is not on the ingredient list. Because a recipe is only a shopping list. A material is also a process, temperatures, order of operations, what gets combined with what and when. And the stakes here are not archaeological. If the durability lives in the process, then understanding it is a lever on the largest material flow on the planet and one of its largest sources of emissions. So the question sharpens. What were the Romans doing while they mixed? Whatever it was, it left those white specks in every wall, every pier, every sample, in full view for 2,000 years, waiting for someone to stop apologizing for them. The first real break came from drilling into the monuments themselves. Between 2002 and 2009, an international team called Romacons pulled cylindrical cores out of Roman harbour concretes, 11 harbours across the Mediterranean, including the breakwaters of Baiae. For the first time, researchers held fresh, uncontaminated samples of concrete that had sat in seawater since the emperors. They even built a reproduction pier in Brindisi harbour, Roman recipe and all, and drilled it year after year to watch what actually happens early in the life of these structures. The geologist Marie Jackson took slices of the ancient cores to the Advanced Light Source, the synchrotron at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and mapped them with X-ray microdiffraction, essentially photographing the mineral structure at the scale of microns. She found minerals that had no business being there. One was a luminous tobermorite, a crystal that in the laboratory normally demands an autoclave, high temperature, high pressure, and even then yields only small quantities. Another was philipsite, a zeolite. Both were sitting inside a structure that had never left the temperature of the sea. Cement chemists initially doubted the result, and who could blame them? As Jackson put it, nobody had ever produced tobermorite at 20 degrees Celsius, nobody except the Romans. The mechanism fell out of the cores. Seawater percolates through the concrete for centuries, slowly dissolving components of the volcanic ash. From those warm, alkaline fluids, platy crystals of tobermorite and philipsite grow, interlocking like shuffled decks of tiny plates, reinforcing the cementing matrix from within. And the crystals do more than fill space. Their structures can lock ions, including the chloride and sulfate species that destroy modern concrete, into their own lattices. The attackers get arrested inside the material. So the paradox inverts. The sea is not failing to destroy Roman marine concrete. The sea is the reagent. Water is the delivery system for the strengthening chemistry. Pliny's phrase, "every day stronger," stops being a flourish and becomes a mineral report. He was right 1900 years early. But this discovery has a ceiling, and it's a hard one. That chemistry is slow, centuries slow. You cannot specify a breakwater today and wait 400 years for its tobermorite to arrive. The finding explains why Roman marine concrete gets stronger over time. It does not explain why it doesn't fall apart in the meantime. It says nothing about the Pantheon's dome, standing in open air with no seawater anywhere in sight. And it does not touch the most stubborn observation of all. The white specks are not a marine phenomenon. They are in the harbour cores, yes, but also in landlocked walls like the city wall at Privernum, south of Rome, which never met a wave in its life. Whatever the specks were doing, they were doing it everywhere the Romans poured. The crystal story explains how the material matures. It does not explain why it survives its own cracks. For that, someone had to put the despised defect itself under the beam. In January 2023, the specks finally got their day in court. A team from MIT and Harvard, with laboratories in Italy and Switzerland, Linda Seymour, Admir Masick and colleagues, published a study in Science Advances on the lime clasts from Privernum's city wall. Same white chunks, new instruments scanning electron microscopy with elemental mapping, X-ray diffraction, Raman spectroscopy. The verdict came from the clasts' own chemistry. They carried signatures of formation at extreme temperatures, the kind of heat produced by one specific shortcut. The Romans, the evidence indicated, were mixing their mortar with quicklime, calcium oxide straight from the kiln, instead of, or alongside, slaked lime, which is quicklime that has already been quenched and tamed in water. The team called it hot mixing. When quicklime hits the wet mix, it reacts furiously and throws off heat. The mortar essentially cooks while it's being stirred. That single choice does two things. It unlocks high-temperature reactions that simply never occur in a cool mix, and it makes the mortar set dramatically faster, a real virtue when you're building harbors by pouring into open sea, where speed matters and labor isn't free. Whether the Romans chose it for the chemistry, the speed, or the cost, we can't say. The honest hypothesis is that self-repair was never named. It may have been a side effect they benefited from without ever explaining. Here is the structural consequence. In a conventional slaked lime mix, the lime dissolves and disperses. Hot mixing leaves the clasts embedded whole, and not as inert pebbles. They emerge brittle, nanoparticulate, with enormous reactive surface, concentrated deposits of calcium distributed through the structure like millions of tiny chemical warehouses. Now run a crack through that material. Finding the clasts weaker than the surrounding matrix, the crack travels preferentially through them. Water seeps in, reacts with the clast fragments, and produces a calcium-rich solution, which recrystallizes as calcite, sealing the very crack that admitted the water. The defect intercepts the damage and repairs it. The team tested this. They cast hot mixed replicas, cracked them 0.5 millimeter wide, and ran water through under pressure. Within about 2 weeks, the flow stopped. The crack had sealed itself with freshly precipitated calcite. An identical sample made without quicklime never healed. The water just kept flowing indefinitely. Step back and look at what that means. Every modern quality control regime would flag those clasts as a mixing failure and reject the batch. What it would be rejecting is the repair system. Roman concrete is heterogeneous on purpose, functionally heterogeneous, a distributed chemical reactor seeded with spare parts. Modern concrete is engineered to be uniform and inert, pristine, passive, and once cracked, entirely alone with its problem. 2,000 years of verdict reversed in a spectrometer. Nobody had looked for virtue in the specks, because nobody looks for virtues in what they have already classified as a flaw. So stack the three mechanisms, and the title of this story pays out. The binder, lime plus volcanic ash, reacts with seawater over centuries to grow interlocking crystals that reinforce the matrix and lock up the very ions that destroy modern concrete. 2. Hot mixing seeds, the material with reactive lime clasts that self-seal small cracks, around 0.5 millimeter, the everyday cracks that let corrosion in. And they do it in weeks, not centuries. 3. There is no steel inside, no rebar, no expansion, no countdown. That last point is the real diagnosis of our own concrete. Modern concrete doesn't fail because the Romans kept a secret we lost. It fails because we optimized for speed, cost, and tensile strength, and we purchased tensile strength with steel. The steel is brilliant, and it is a clock. In marine exposure, design lives of 50 to 100 years aren't pessimism, they're arithmetic. And this story has already left the laboratory. Mazik co-founded a company. DMAT spun out of MIT in 2021 to commercialize the hot mixing findings. Its additives carry CE certification in Europe and are already poured into real infrastructure in Italy and Switzerland. Highway barriers, water tanks, pavements. The company claims its mixes double service life and cut carbon emissions by up to 60%. Those are its own figures, not settled science. In October 2025, it raised $4.5 million to push into the United States and the Emirates. Sit with that irony for a second. Some of the most advanced materials laboratories on Earth are now selling a process improvement that is 2,000 years old. But don't drift into nostalgia. Roman concrete is weak in tension. That is precisely why the Romans built arches and domes, shapes that keep the material permanently squeezed. It will not replace reinforced concrete in bridges or towers. The future isn't copying Rome, it's hybridizing Roman chemistry with modern engineering, self-sealing binders, less cement, and steel protected by a material that patches its own scratches. The Romans left harbors that outlived their empire, and we have finally understood why, well enough to sell the lesson in highway barriers. Which leaves one question, and it isn't technical. We now know how to make a material that heals itself and could stand for centuries. Will we choose it? Or does an industry that earns its living on the replacement cycle keep finding it more profitable to build for 50 years and get paid to build it all twice?